All right, I think I'll get started. I know we also have attendees joining. So grateful to those of you who are joining us today. I'm Emily Lieb, and along with Professor Martha Minow, I'm hosting this colloquium series throughout the semester. Professor Minow and I developed the weekly colloquium as a forum for discussion of the many ways that legal rules and practices are being tested and are responding to challenges brought on by COVID-19. So today is the last session of our weekly series. And throughout the semester, we've brought together members of the Harvard Law School community while we're all remote to explore a range of different areas of law and the legal response to COVID, talking about things such as health and healthcare, regulation of labor, safety, immigration, criminal justice, election law, protection of basic needs, and the scope of government authority. We've taken a particular focus on how the pandemic especially burdens marginalized communities, notably Black, Latinx, Native American communities, and other people of color, and Americans who are living at the margins, really the growing number of Americans who are facing really extreme hardship and poverty. So we've looked at how law and policy decisions have shaped and continue to shape this landscape. So since today is our final session, I'm going to take an extra moment for our some thank yous. I first want to thank Dee Manning for supporting this series from the start. I want to thank our fantastic teaching fellows who have been working behind the scenes today and all of the days, Bridget Slater, Jeremy Dang, and Taylor Dodson, and the students who have been working with us on blog posts that have gone along with many of these topics. I want to thank Ellie Benet and Isaac Khan, who have been behind the scenes and really made all of this happen in terms of getting the speakers here and getting us all on Zoom. And I want to thank our fantastic HLS community and amazing colleagues who are speaking today and have spoken throughout the series. It's been really the biggest pleasure for me to get to work with and be inspired by all of you and your deep thoughtfulness, legal expertise, and leadership in this brave new world that we're facing. And lastly, I can't put into words how grateful I am to Martha for partnering with me on this series and for sharing her creativity and boundless enthusiasm for all of these topics, her love and respect for all of our colleagues and their work, and her passion for thinking about the ways, great and small, that law can really be a tool for equity in a more just society. So thank you for inspiring me and partnering together. As a reminder, this session, as all of our sessions, is being recorded and will be available afterwards on our website, which is covidseries.law.harvard.edu. We also on that site have a blog, which will be ongoing through winter. We are going to have a bunch of students continuing to write on topics, so you can check back and see kind of dynamic updates on a lot of these legal and policy issues as they play out. And lastly, we hope that those of you who are here today will ask questions. So we have a really a special group of speakers today to really talk about a kind of more wide-ranging discussion on some topics we haven't covered yet in the series, introduce some new topics, reflect on some of the issues that we've raised over the past 11 weeks, and then to point to further work that we can do. And we've invited as panelists 3 faculty members that we know bring wisdom and reflectiveness about where we are and the lessons we've learned and what to be looking forward to in the future. So I'm gonna, Martha and I are gonna moderate together, but I'm just gonna introduce the speakers and really turn it over to her to get us started. So our speakers today are Professor Kristen Stilt, who's Professor of Law and Faculty Director of both the Animal Law and Policy Program and the Program on Law and Society in the Muslim World. Prior to coming to HLS, she was the Harry R. Harrow Professor in International Law at Northwestern Law School and Professor of History at Northwestern University. Her research focuses on a range of issues in Islamic law and society, in historical and contemporary context, and she also writes and really is a national leader in animal law, bringing together different students and faculty and outside experts on this growing area of law. She was a Carnegie Scholar for her work on constitutional Islam and was awarded a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship and has also received fellowships from Fulbright and Fulbright Hays. Next, we have Professor Dehlia Umunna, who is a clinical professor of law at HLS and the faculty deputy director of the Criminal Justice Institute. My computer appears to be frozen, but I'm not sure if you all can hear me. So
Let's see.
We can, and so maybe we should now just start with Kristen. Let's do that.
okay.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in, and then Dehlia and Jody will get their due introductions when I'm done. So thank you so much, Martha and Emily and the student organizers, as well as my co-panelists, Dehlia and Jody. I'm so looking forward to hearing from everyone and the questions as well. So the impacts of the pandemic are obviously devastating and widespread. And the series has focused very carefully and methodically on them week after week. It's just been outstanding. And so in this final session today, I want to take a step back and ask, why did we have a pandemic in the first place? And what can we do to prevent another one? And I want to briefly challenge two prevailing narratives about the pandemic, and then the origins of the pandemic, and then offer suggestions for what we can do to reduce risks in the future. So the first prevailing narrative is that this pandemic is just a rare event, that a confluence of unfortunate events happened to take place in 2020, but that in general, these things just aren't that common. And that's reinforced by the analogy, of course, to the last global pandemic more than 100 years ago. And so I want to say that that narrative is wrong, that COVID-19 is actually not a rare event at all. It's global reach, yes, definitely. But fundamentally, a virus like this one is not. So I want to make sure we've all heard the term zoonotic disease. So a zoonosis or a zoonotic disease is an infection that starts in animals, and then it's transmissible to humans, to human animals. As animals, we are very susceptible to receiving diseases from our animal brothers and sisters. And so what happens is that the virus emerges in the animal, but it's not fatal to that animal. And the animal serves as the host, and the host carries it. And then at some point, it may or may not spill over into a human when there's human contact. There are many, many zoonotic viruses. They evolve quickly as a virus. They're not affected by antibiotics, and they can have high fatality rates. Ebola, West Nile, Marburg, the virus that caused SARS, the virus that caused MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, monkeypox, rabies, Nipah, Hendra, and HIV. Some of these you've heard of, some of these you may not have. Some have had lower human-to-human transmission rates than COVID, but many have had higher death rates. So MERS had a death rate of 35%, Nipah, 40 to 75%. And then when we think, well, that's done, we're done with that, it's not true. And the hosts host the virus, and it likely continues to exist in the hosts, and it can jump back to humans in another outbreak, maybe in a mutated form for which any vaccine that was prepared is no longer effective. And that's what's happening if you've heard about the minks in Denmark. So there's a belief, maybe not scientifically substantiated yet, that COVID has mutated in the 15 million minks that are farmed for their fur in Denmark. And that if it were to come back to humans, it would be a form that the vaccine is not expected to cover. And so there's a question of whether or not they'll all be killed as a result. And so for thinking about this, this story of zoonotic diseases and their prevalence in a larger context, I highly recommend a book called Spillover by Daniel Quammen. It's from 2012, and I want to just give you a quick quote, and then I'll move on to my second narrative. So here's a quote, again from 2012. The next big human pandemic, bigger than AIDS or the 1918 influenza, is likely to be caused by a zoonotic virus, ones that jump from an animal to infect a human host. Experts call such an event spillover, and they warn us to brace ourselves. When the next big one arrives, what will it look like? from which innocent animal, host animal will it emerge? Will we be ready? So it sounds like someone's writing that today about something in the future, but that's 2012. We've been rolling the dice basically every day on when the next big one would come. So quickly, the second prevailing narrative, and of course it's related, and that's that COVID-19 was caused by something that happened out there in China. It was due to a live animal market, and that market was driven by consumption of animals that, we don't even eat here. That's the narrative. The cause is remote, and all we can do for prevention is just to shut down those kinds of markets, again, out there in a different country and culture. And so that narrative, I'd also say, is wrong. So yes, it's true that a bat was the most likely source of the transmission, likely in a cave in southern China, where someone was catching bats for sale at a market, or perhaps guano to sell as fertilizer. And there, it likely went to Wuhan and spread through the market. But to confine the emergence of COVID to those facts and to place blame on that unknown individual or the consumers who drove a market for bat meat is a mistake for the big picture. What is that big picture? Human contact with animals, mostly wild, but not only, is what creates the spillover risk. And humans are coming into increasing contact with animals due to our encroachment on their habitat. Deforestation is a major cause. So that's the clearing of forests. It's not only bad for climate change, it releases carbon into the air and warms the atmosphere, but scientific studies have showed deforestation is linked to outbreaks of infectious diseases because it creates that proximity between humans and animals that was previously further apart. What are the drivers of deforestation? Human expansion, mining, timber, animal agriculture. That is, raising animals to consume them and raising the crops needed to feed the animals. So last year, we lost the size of a soccer field every 6 seconds to deforestation. And Brazil accounted for a third of the total loss, mainly for agriculture. As you know, Brazil is a huge meat producing country. Ironically and sadly, deforestation has increased since COVID due to illegal activity and the inability of governments to crack down. And so I want to say that our lifestyles here, not just in China, not just around the world, our lifestyles, the food we eat, increase the risks of the next pandemic. So for prevention, we can control a lot in terms of reducing the risks of human-animal contact. So I'll stop there. I hope in the questions, someone will ask me about bacterial pandemics, which is also another great source of concern from our food supply. But I'll stop there and pass it on.
All right, I think I'm gonna, if it's okay, you guys can hear me now. I had a Zoom moment there. I believe our next speaker is going to be Professor Jody Freeman. So let me give you an intro, and then I think we're gonna end with Dehlia. Jody Freeman is the Archibald Cox Professor of Law, a leading scholar of administrative law and environmental law, and the founding director of the Environmental and Energy Law program at Harvard Law School, which is really a pioneering research center on climate and energy policy. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She also previously served as the Counselor for Energy and Climate Change in the Obama White House, and in that role was the architect of the historic agreement with the auto industry to double fuel efficiency standards, and this set the first federal greenhouse gas standards, which launched the Obama administration's climate program under the Clean Air Act. She's written extensively about climate change, environmental law, environmental regulation, and executive power, and I'm excited to turn it over to her to speak.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here see my colleagues. It's always lovely to see my great colleagues. And since we're in a mode of thank yous, I'll just say big thank you to both Martha and to Emily for 2 different reasons. Martha is my great mentor. Now that I'm middle-aged, it sounds funny to talk about still having and needing mentors, but Martha is one of the best mentors a person could ever have. And if there's anyone who has spent her life devoted to trying to rectify inequality and injustice, it is Martha Minow. So I'm delighted to be here. And Emily is someone who I've discovered to be just terrific and wonderful to work with. And we've had a chance to do some overlapping things. So I'm delighted to be here with both of you. And of course, Kristen and Dehlia. So here are a couple of thoughts to contribute to the discussion. And I'm going to be mostly very positive. I'm feeling strangely, perhaps unusually positive. I'll talk about the energy climate connection to the pandemic in a moment, but what I want to say is that I view the pandemic as the great exposer and the great amplifier of things that we already were experiencing and witnessing, but it has managed to sort of give us a much more intense view into things that we might have not seen quite as vividly. For example, I think it's really exposed the kind of inequality in society that I'm sure you've been talking about all semester, but in a very useful way that I think will produce change. And I think it's amplified in my domain, inequality in terms of how public health disasters, environmental harms, and indeed climate-related impacts all disproportionately impact minority communities, Black and brown and low-income communities. And I think expose that unfairness in a way that you can no longer ignore. And the fact that that exposure of who bears the brunt of these public health disasters, that exposure, along with this sort of cry for social justice from the law enforcement realm, have coincided. And I think that coincidence is extremely positive. It's painful, but I think it's extremely positive. And I think you can see the coming together of these different cries for social justice and environmental equality and a cry to do something about climate change has all sort of come together. And in my realm, it sort of manifested itself in this Green New Deal notion. I call it a notion because it's not a particular set of policies. It's not a legislative proposal. It's an ambition. And the Green New Deal, I think, is a combination of wishes for great progress toward a cleaner energy economy and also progress toward greater social justice and good jobs. It's an economic policy, it's an environmental policy, and it just speaks to the moment, I think. So COVID is coinciding with all of this, and I think it's too soon to make sense of it. It's very hard to come up with a narrative about how that coincidence of events will play out. But I can just make a few observations sort of from my perch where I'm seated. First of all, COVID exposed what happens when you don't have great planning. And for those of us in the world of climate and energy, we've spent a lot of time trying to tell the government that they need a better plan, that there are risks that may be low percentage, low probability, but very high consequence risks, like the risk of rising sea levels and all the dramatic events you hear about. And it's very hard to get plans put in place. So when you're not, the great lesson is what happens when you're not prepared. The other thing is this experience of the pandemic exposes the need for coordination at every level of government to deal with disasters, every level of government across governments internationally, and then between governments and the private sector and nonprofit world. It's just a terrific lesson in how hard it is to coordinate. And I think too, relatedly, if you wonder what the government's for, as many in society do, this is the moment when you realize you need the government for some things. And, I think it's astonishing that Amazon has produced possibly the most coordinated response of any actor to the pandemic in the United States. I mean, I am so impressed with the fact that Amazon has managed to furnish supplies for the entire country. It's an amazing thing that we've turned to the private sector for this in the absence of, in my view, the absence of federal leadership. So this experience, I think, has shone a spotlight on why you need the government to work and how important leadership is in situations like this. And I see that parallel is true for all big problems of this kind, climate change included, that requires tremendous coordination and global cooperation. On the positive side, I would just say, I think this is a moment of incredible innovation and adaptation. If you look around you, the kinds of things we've been asked to do, even in the most parochial sense, we all had to master Zoom quickly. Like 10 years of learning was condensed into like a few months. We all pivoted and have transformed our lives, and we've engaged technology in new ways. And that, to me, especially for young people, especially for the people in this seminar, suggests what opportunity awaits you. Because out of this pandemic will come the need for new solutions to new problems, and we will be using technology in new ways. And you guys are on the cutting edge of this. So there will be a need for inventiveness and creativity, and for new legal solutions and new regulatory solutions and new government contributions and new private sector contributions. And I'm quite excited for you guys. I think in some sense, it's been very hard on you to live through this period. You have to go to school this way through this period. On the other hand, I think you're going to benefit from the positive things that come out of this. So that's why I feel quite upbeat about it. The last thing I'll mention, the very last thing is, in terms of, if you're interested in just energy and climate policy in particular, it's very hard right now to figure out what this pandemic will have done on the energy and climate front, because our patterns of life have changed so dramatically. Where we live might change. The density of our cities might change, because now we've all learned and have adapted to working remotely. Maybe there will be great migration. Not sure if that's going to be true. Maybe we no longer want to use public transportation because we're scared of other people. To that extent, if that's true, we're going to have some impacts that are quite negative, because we'll all be driving in vehicles rather than using public transportation. So there are these trends in society as a result of the pandemic that could have real impact on how we live and how we work and how we transport ourselves around. And that could be very significant, but it's too soon to tell how that will work out. So I'll leave it there. I guess what I'm saying is, I think this reinforces why it's good to be in law school, because you're getting the tools you need to contribute positively when we begin to come out of this pandemic and have to think of solutions.
Thank you. I love that. I'm glad to be ending on hopefully a positive note, although I think there's a lot to dig in on that. So finally, our last speaker is Professor Dehlia Umunna, who I got cut off trying to interview earlier, so apologies for that. But Dehlia is a clinical professor of law, the faculty deputy director of the Criminal Justice Institute, where she supervises third-year law students in their representation of adult and juvenile clients in criminal and juvenile proceedings in Massachusetts courts. She also coaches the HLS National Criminal Justice Trial Advocacy and HLS Black Law Student Association trial teams, and has led them to numerous awards. And she also serves as a faculty member for Gideon's Promise. She was recently appointed by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court to the newly established Bar Admissions Curriculum Committee to assist in crafting the uniform bar exam. And prior to coming to HLS, she spent several years at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia as a trial attorney. And she is very well loved by her many clinical students that she has worked with and impacted over the years.
Thank you, Emily, for that lovely introduction. And I want to echo Jody and Kristen's thanks to you for the amazing and wonderful work that you and your team have put together. And if there's one thing that I have learned during this pandemic, it's to appreciate things and people ever more so than I did pre-COVID. So I particularly want to thank Martha, whose kindness and generosity of spirit is just so huge. It's very rare that I get to say this, but I really love that woman. She is a masterful teacher, an incredible mentor, and just a decent human being, a person of integrity and quite caring. I will never forget, I never did quite tell her this, but I think maybe a month or so ago, she sent me a note that says, "How are you doing?" And attached to it was a leaf, a picture of leaves. And I thought, wow, she's actually thinking about me, and doesn't she have a lot to think about? And I thought, that's the kind of person I always want to be, a person who actually cares. So Thank you, Martha and Emily and your team for this wonderful series. Very much appreciated. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes sort of taking a quick look back at the year, but then thinking about, as Jody indicated, some positives that have come out of this pandemic for us. I don't need to belabor the point. You already know that this year has been, the year 2020 has been unprecedented in so many ways. I had one student tell me the other day, I just can't wait for it to be over with. And I just said, you and me both, right? So this year has been fraught with disinformation and misinformation, housing and food insecurity. Economic uncertainty, impasse in moving forward immigration policies, numerous climate crises, political unrest, a lack of access to justice, a decline in civil discourse. My 16-year-old son told me the other day, Mom, there are words that we can now say that's acceptable to now say on television because of a certain person, which I have told him we can't say that in our house, but that's a discussion for another day. We've witnessed the erosion of democratic norms, decimation of our ideals, and we've learned new phrases like social distancing and Zooming and isolation and PPEs and N95. And I am still trying to master the act of unmuting yourself before you start speaking on Zoom. Although, to be quite honest, being muted a few times has saved my bacon because of the ruckus that was going on behind me. We've also noticed that racism in its ugliest and nastiest form has been on full display in 2020, particularly in the space in which I occupy, the criminal legal system. In 2020, we witnessed the weaponization of race by a white woman when she called the police on a Black bird watcher. We were witnesses as millions marched, risking their lives to give voice to lives that have otherwise been silenced by police brutality. Lives like Ahmaud Arbery's, Breonna Taylor's, George Floyd. And as you well know, the list goes on and on and on. In the last 6 months, we've seen the ravaging impact of COVID-19 and how it sends Black and brown and Native American people to the hospital at quadruple the rate of others. With over 10 million people in the United States affected, over 250,000 dead, and hundreds more who have died of the virus while in prison, it is an understatement to say that the trifecta of the pandemic, racial injustice, and political unrest have really, really impacted us as humans. And nowhere is this more evident than in the criminal legal space. Now, in the criminal legal space, I don't call it the criminal justice system anymore. I call it the criminal legal system because there's very little that's quite frankly just about it. We deal with humans, mostly Black and brown people who have had the misfortune of just being poor. And then you layer that with the many times that they're dealing with mental health issues and addiction issues. And what we have is the unfettered criminalization of poverty. Human beings in this space been really delegated or relegated to instances where they're being punished because they are unable to comply with COVID precautions. They're unable to comply with mask mandates or stay-at-home orders. They don't have enough money to hire babysitters so they can go to work, so they invariably end up losing jobs. And if you're in the criminal legal system, having a job is essential to not only survival, but hopefully keeping you out of the system. And when you lose your job, that becomes problematic. So the impact of this virus on us humans cannot be overstated. And like I said earlier, the trifecta of the virus, racial injustice, and political unrest have tested and challenged and amplified the inequities in the already broken criminal legal system. We are feeling it acutely. I want to highlight the impact on the pandemic on Mr. Marvin Leon, an immigrant from Haiti. a client that I have been representing for the past 2 years. He was charged with malicious destruction of property, in essence, kicking in a door of a neighbor's house. In addition to being charged, he struggles with alcoholism. Mr. Leon languished at the Bellerica jail because he had violated the conditions of his release by going back to the house where his ex-girlfriend lived. At the Bellerica jail, Mr. Leon called me every day, every single day. Dehlia, do what you can to get me out of here. Do what you can. There are people dying. The guards have to reuse masks. And we are being exposed. And with every call and with every cry, we filed emergency motions to be able to get him out. Things were already bad pre-pandemic, but now things were worse. I want to highlight the story of Amanda, a white woman, a veteran, a woman who served this country and came back and is dealing with PTSD and other addictions. I've had the privilege and honor of representing Amanda for the past 3 years. And one of the things I love about her is she's a brilliant artist, but she also struggles. She struggles daily. She's really gifted, but she struggles daily with the ravages of addiction to crack and heroin. And in the 3 years I've represented her pre-COVID, she had good days and bad days. In April, she gave birth to Chance, her baby boy. And when I went to the BMC to visit with her, you could always tell that COVID was going to have more of an impact. You see, she didn't have a chance to see Chance because due to the virus, they took the baby boy away and we've not been able to see him since then. I want to highlight the many men and women and children who are being held in jails in Norfolk and Suffolk and Middlesex counties, who are being impacted by what exactly the virus is doing. And when people call and when we file motions, it seems like no one is listening. These are the men and women, the faces of the ravaging impact of COVID-19. I want to highlight the men and women who keep saying to me, when is my case going to be over? You see, because we represent people whose cases keep getting postponed due to the surge in the virus and over our objection, because some courts still can't figure out how to hold hearings over Zoom. And our clients, the poor men and women, the Black and brown folks, who are the victims, the face of what this virus can do, continue to have the stigma of a criminal case hanging over them. Now, I think my colleagues have talked about whether or not this pandemic may be preventable, but I want to reflect just on something that gives me hope. We may not be able to prevent the next pandemic. Matter of fact, I'm a realist. I suspect that we are going to have something else that comes through. Whoever thought that we will have had the kind of 4 years that we did? Nobody saw that coming. Actually, we did, but we ignored it. Having said that, I am hopeful because of 3 observations. The first is that human beings are the most important capital, period. The resilience of the human spirit, our ability to make the best of a horrific, horrendous, horrible situation has been amplified during the pandemic. I have seen my students at CJI, our staff at CJI, my clients make lemonade out of gross lemons, almost bad lemons, and we've made lemonade out of it. I have seen our clients stretch and bend and yet not break. I have seen people march in protest demanding change. I have seen us rally because of that human spirit. It's the one capital that the government can't really take away from us. Second observation, the ability, I think Jody mentioned this earlier, the ability of the human spirit, of humans to adapt and evolve. We are a very inventive and creative bunch, people. I can tell you that. You see, I've seen my clients making masks out of recycled trash. I have seen my students come up with very creative ways of practicing over Zoom. I have seen my students come up with ways that I will never have thought of on how to communicate and connect with their clients. I appreciate our ability to be inventive and creative. And finally, I'm going to say this and then I'll be quiet. The third observation brings us to this question of what can we do better? What can we be better? And the answer to that question is yes, absolutely yes, we can be better and we can do better, right? The one thing that I said earlier, which is through this pandemic in the criminal justice space, the one thing that I have learned is now an appreciation for the things that we all took for granted, right? I used to take for granted the fact that I could reach out and shake my client's hand and connect with them that way. I used to take that for granted. I will never take a handshake for granted ever again when we get back to shaking hands, right? Hugs, for example, when somebody's in distress, being able to reach out and say, I'm here for you. We'll never take that for granted. And so in the spirit of what's happening to us, we've learned to appreciate the things that we took for granted. We have learned to answer the question, what really matters? And for me, it's really evolved and it's really changed. The things that I thought mattered in January are very much not what I think matter now. And for that, I am grateful. And it's through that lens that I see hope as we move forward. It is what keeps me grounded as I teach and instruct and represent people, that we are capable of not only evolving, but really getting an appreciation for the things that we initially took for granted. So I will rest there, and I am hoping that I will get questions on other ways that we can concretely be appreciative, but also the concrete and consequential ways that we can begin to make a difference, particularly in the criminal legal space. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. We had hoped to hear words of wisdom and clarity, and we have that and more. And we have one question already to ask each of you, which is, you've all in different ways talked about the way that the pandemic has exposed our failures to plan, to think. So what are concrete steps for any level of human being, government, nonprofit organization, corporations, to prepare for the next crisis, with Professor Stilt specifically with regard to biodiversity and deforestation, with Professor Freeman specifically with the sea rise and climate change, and also the environmental justice issues, and with Professor Umunna with the utter failures of our criminal legal space, where we will have more pandemics and we will have more injustice. So what if you could wave a magic wand, but work with the world that we currently have, what is the change that you hope will happen in the next 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? Professor Stilt, you're nodding.
I'm nodding that as usual. You've asked us a very profound and deep question that calls for lots of thought. But to answer it quite briefly, I would say there's some really great studies that talk about the cost of investing in protection of forests and green spaces and reforesting and rewilding. And the cost of that is so much less than the cost that this pandemic has cost the world. And so I would say that would be one of the most important steps, is to think carefully and seriously about our loss of biodiversity, which, as you pointed out, Martha, is another risk factor, because, you know, so many ironies here, but when biodiversity is lost, when species are lost, The ones that remain are the generalist species, the ones that can adapt and survive. And those are the ones that also typically are more likely to carry zoonotic diseases than the ones that we have lost. So species lost is really a double or a triple hit. So investment in protection of forests, of reforesting, not just stopping what we're doing, and paying serious attention to biodiversity. And I have to say that, in the zoonotic transmission, some of it indeed is about food supply. African communities that rely on bushmeat have made people at greater risk for things like Ebola, Chinese consumption. We have to deal with our global food system. And the answer is absolutely not to put a factory farm in the middle of Angola, right? To stop as a substitute for bushmeat consumption. Like, that is not the answer. The answer has to move towards plant-based food systems. That is going to go towards deforestation, that is going to go towards climate change, and that is also going to go towards the risk, decreasing the risk of zoonotic transmission. So our global food system is broken, and I would pair that with the deforestation, biodiversity, and that's what I would do. And that's what the Animal Law and Policy Program is very much focused on, as well as major places. And I would say we need to get antibiotics out of factory farms too, but that's another question maybe we'll have time for.
Well, that's great. And certainly the concrete work that your program is doing and that Emily Broad-Lieb's program is doing are very good examples of steps that can be taken. Professor Freeman?
It's just a very hard question, the magic wand question. I'm thinking about one thing, which is we have this rampant short-termism in our politics and in our policies, and it cuts across all the sectors. CEOs think about quarterly reports, and members of Congress think in 2-year cycles or maybe 6-year cycles. And it's very hard to find a pocket of the society or economy where anybody's doing long-term planning. I've only found 2 institutions that do it. And both are cause different kinds of feelings, different reactions. One is the military, they engage in long-term planning, and the other is the oil and gas industry. I guess I really would like to see long-term thinking pervade our institutions to a greater extent. Now, that may be impossible wish, but there's something about scenario planning, and it sounds very technocratic, but when you start thinking longer term, then you begin to see, well, what are the steps necessary to be in a position to react so that we can be prepared for the things you can't perfectly predict. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would embed that kind of planning in our institutions. And then just on, again, speaking to my sort of issues, energy, climate stuff, I think if we really can get this country and help to lead the world on a transition to a different kind of energy supply, it will have many, many salutary benefits. It will help repair the planet. It will lead to healthier living for all of us. I think it will also repair some injustice because the way we use energy, the way we power our lives, the way we eat, as Kristen and Emily would attest, they have these harms associated with them and costs associated with them, and it falls disproportionately on our minority communities. So to move to a different energy system for the globe is actually, it actually has benefits in terms of doing, in terms of repairing some inequalities. So I'd like to see us get that moving, which is going to be a combination of federal policy, state policy, local policy, nonprofit action, private sector leadership. And you need leaders for that. You need people to say, this is the direction, the trajectory the society and the economy need to go in, and we need to take some risks, and we need to think big. And so that's what I would like to see. That requires a certain level of political commitment that, frankly, I don't see in the United States Congress. So that's a little depressing to me. But I think it's possible that the executive branch of the U.S. government is headed more that way. with the new president-elect. So maybe we could unstick the U.S. Congress somehow. I'm not sure.
I think we have to give you two magic wands, but I very much appreciate your point about planning. I mean, I learned recently a phrase that apparently is very familiar to others, which is plans are not important. Planning is what's important. And so it's the practice of scenario imagining and devising, you know, what would we do if, rather than imagining it's a blueprint that you build the house for. And yes, we need to be doing that much more. And for law school, we need to be doing less looking backwards and more looking forward. Professor Umunna, the same question, but very concretely, have there been any examples of prisons or jails that have responded to COVID in a responsible way? I myself expected there would be far more release programs than I have seen. And I wonder, are there any examples? You talk so powerfully about the resilience of individuals making their own masks and so forth, but any examples, and yes or no, but what concrete steps could make a difference?
So the answer to your question is no. I can't point to any example of a prison that has done this well. And that's really unfortunate. In fact, what you've seen is a lot of lawsuits trying to force courts to make the decision to force prisons to do it right. Even here locally in Massachusetts, we just had Rachel Rollins, the Suffolk County DA, and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley holding a press conference trying to guilt and shame the prisons into releasing prisoners. So if I had a magic wand, and like you said, that you probably will need more than one for this, I will empty the prisons. That's what we should be doing. A number of people, most of the people in our jails, in our prisons are there for nonviolent crimes. They will be able to do well and be supervised on the outside if we cared enough about that, if we were invested enough in that. Justice Sotomayor just spoke out on this issue regarding the lawsuit in Texas and saying that there were people who needlessly died without being convicted, by the way, because died due to COVID while being held in jail. And so that's the first thing I will do, take a hard look at what's happening within our prisons, who is in there, and can we safely release, and if we must have prisons and jails, let's take a look at who is in there. And for the people that don't need to be there, individuals who have low-level offenders with mental health issues and severe addictions, they don't need to be in the prisons. We do know, we don't need a scientist to tell us that the pandemic will proliferate in places where there are people close in together. And so if that's the case, why are we overcrowding prisons? The other thing that we're not doing and that we concretely should do is invest in mental health for some of our people, some of the individuals who are within the walls, right? If you invest in people who need mental health services, chances are you will reduce recidivism, and folks will not need to go to engage in behavior that will land them in prison. I also think that if you are going to build prisons or build courthouses, you need to design them better. There are some courthouses our courthouse in Roxbury. I live in Roxbury. I live not too far away from our courthouse. I literally can walk there. It will take me 5 minutes to get there. In one of the courtrooms, it's windowless. Just imagine that. In one of the busiest courthouses in the Commonwealth. It's the third session and it has no windows. And on any given day, you can have 60 to 80 people in that confined space. What do you think will happen? So if you are going to, if people are so invested in building prisons and courthouses, design them better. At least put a window in one, right? Put a window in one. And then the last thing I will say in terms of concrete is we need to get to a point where we actually care about the demographic. I think our empathy well for marginalized individuals is so low, it's so deficient. And because of that, we don't think prospectively about these folks. We are more in a reactionary mode. Oh yeah, we do have prisoners, and now what do we do? That's problematic. If we actually cared, we will then, like Jody said, think more concretely long-term about how to address their needs. And the final thing I will say is, let's be better about technology. This is if we think that there'll be another pandemic, for example, we know that. Why can't we have technology that allows people to have their cases move forward? It's now it's been since March, and a courthouse, for example, like Roxbury, doesn't even have Zoom capacity and capability, and that's problematic. It hinders the work that we do. It continues to marginalize people of color. And for as long as we're not thinking prospectively about how to really serve these communities, we will continue to fail. So concretely, those are the 4 or 5 things that I just mentioned that I think we can do.
That's excellent. Thank you. I don't think we'll have time to get to Professor Stilt to talk about bacterial pandemics, but we need to learn about that. I don't think we'll get to ask Professor Freeman, what's your whispered advice to President-elect Biden of his first day executive orders, though we look forward to probably what you'll be speaking about that. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to Professor Umunna to talk about so many of the next steps on the concrete initiatives you just identified. But I have one closing question, as I also use this as a chance to wrap up the entire series that we've had here. Extraordinary range of topics, and talk about windows onto the world of law, the world of marginalized communities, whether we looked at the way in which our whole governmental system and allocation of powers is strained, but also may be working in response to COVID, elections and voting, the rules and practices around housing and food access, employment, consumer protection, money, access to justice. And I just want to say one lesson that I've learned and wonder if you can comment in a lightning round. Last thought to our students. The lesson that I've learned is how interdependent we are as human beings. There's a way in which my well-being is literally tied to how others in this community are acting and how much access they have to healthcare and whether or not, frankly, they wear a mask. And that notion of interdependence, of course, is why I'm so grateful to everyone who helped make this series so powerful and meaningful, particularly Professor Lieb, my partner in crime here. But in addition, the tremendous staff and students and the over 40 members of the community who've participated. My question to you, though, is in law and in law school, we don't do a lot of talking about interdependence. We talk a lot about individuals. And I think about the fields in which you each are expert and how important interdependence is. If there's any future for us to be able to handle the pandemics and the criminal injustices and the climate change problems, we're going to have to figure out how to take this on board. So is there any way that you know we can, or we already do, teach about interdependence as part of the toolkit or the concepts that our future lawyers need to enact? Who's willing?
I'll jump in. I do nothing but talk about interdependence. That's all I do is talk about coordination, overlap, because I talk about government all day long, and I teach about government, I teach about agencies, I teach about the federal system in particular, but it's true of the states, it's true of everything, it's true of other countries. All I do is talk about the need to row in the same direction, coordinate, reach out. And so I feel very comfortable with that question, Martha. So and in a very small scale way too. You know, I think that all of this has exposed our vulnerability. You're emphasizing interdependence, but I also think we have this shared feeling now of tremendous vulnerability. And I feel like in our classrooms, I'm teaching more about that all the time too. And talking about our community in the, again, the most narrow parochial way, which is let's take care of each other. You know, let's fill in for each other, help out your colleague, you know. So there's this very small sense in which we can instill that in our students, very local way in which we can say, you're all in this together, you know, you're an independent sub community. So that's a local way to do it. But yeah, I think it's important to talk about bridge building and the ways in which we must engage each other. So I appreciate that question very much.
Well, and you also, Jody, teach and write about public and private interdependence as well. So that's great. Kristen?
Sure, I would say on an academic level, I think about it all the time too, because people think, oh, animal law, that's some niche little thing where you're worried about, you know, purebred dogs, and nothing could be farther from the truth, as I hope I've conveyed here today. And, you know, we had a visiting professor, Justin Marceau, in the spring, who's written about the unfortunate carceral, the urge to criminalize in the animal law movement and how problematic that has been. And so, you know, we are all connected. And just as you were thinking about that, talking about that, Martha, I hope that this sense of what I do affects other people, we're able to carry forth with us. Choices I make affect the children that are in my daughter's classroom, right? The webs that we have of decisions we make and how they affect other people. I hope that we can carry that forward, and even to broaden it to people we don't know, we have not met, as Dehlia was urging us to do. And then I will say for our students, carry that with you and realize how much you can do with what you're learning now. And, you know, I'm always a huge proponent of public interest work, government work. And I would say this moment just even emphasize students, grab onto that, see what you can do and how important the work that you can do can be in the world, and do what matters. Do what matters to you.
Thank you. Professor Umunna. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
I still haven't learned the lesson. Unmute thyself, woman. First, unmute thyself. Okay, so Martha, that's an excellent question. It is actually at the very core of what we do at CJI, right? We are such a client-centered outfit that the very thing we tell our students is this: none of this is about you. It's about all of us. And if one of you is not doing well, the rest of us can't be doing well. I was born in London, and my dad's Nigerian and my mom is Sierra Leonean. And so I come from cultures that really believe in it takes a village, right? That you can't exist in silos, you can't exist as individuals, you exist as a community or you don't exist at all, and that we are indeed depending on each other. One of my guiding principles is this idea that you have to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly and defend the rights of the poor and needy. And so I teach my students that. They come away knowing the sense of community, knowing that their actions in private and in public have long-term ramifications. And so they're being trained to work really hard to care not only about what impacts them, but what impacts others. And then the question we always end up with is, what good can I do? How can I make sure somebody else, I bring them along and it's not just me going on this journey? And so it is central to what we teach at CJI. I'm happy we end on this question. I am hoping if there's anything the pandemic has taught us, it's this idea of gratitude and appreciating the small things, the little things that we always took for granted, and really being invested in one another, caring about one another in a way that we never thought possible before. And I think that's really the only way we forge ahead.
Can't imagine a better way to end, and I accept to express my gratitude to each of you for your important work, searing and brilliant insights, and generosity to be here today. To Emily Broad-Lieb, and on behalf of her and everyone who helped make this series possible, I send everyone best wishes. Stay safe, stay sane, and be interdependent and care about others. Thank you so much.